So today I'll be doing an experiment using two different types of compost that's often recommended on the internet and giving you the results so you can make an informed choice. Hi there Maple fans, and in this series of videos I'll be sharing what I do throughout an entire year on a monthly basis. Please note that these months are based on UK timings, but of course can easily be adapted to anywhere else in the world. So it's now the end of July, and in the UK we haven't had much of a summer, but there have been some hot days, and the decisions that people have made about what compost mixture to use suddenly become more and more relevant. So if you search on the internet, you'll get two basic answers to what compost mixture to use. Either a very, very free draining compost with loads of pine bark, perlite, grit, sand, that sort of thing, or perhaps a 50-50 mix of herbaceous compost with a more mature compost. People will argue with a lot of passion actually which is the best to use. I don't believe that one can be right for all circumstances, or at least you need to be informed about the pros and cons so you can make an informed decision. I will of course let you know which one I choose, but at the end of the day it's entirely up to you which one works best for you in your location in the world, particularly because I live in the UK, other climates are very, very different. It's also really worth thinking about what your particular lifestyle is. Are you able to water every day, or do you need them to be sort of self-sufficient water-wise for a few days while you go away perhaps? So this is a little Acer called Carl's Corner. It is in one of my own pots, but I haven't actually added any compost to this whatsoever. So this is the original compost that the plant came in from the nursery. It's very, very free draining. You can see it's quite sort of fibrous. There's lots and lots of organic material in there really, and we'll see how that actually performs. And one school of thought would be, if it's good enough for the Acer nurseries that need to sell these plants and value their reputation, why wouldn't we carry on using this kind of mixture? And that's all part of this test really, to see whether that's the wise thing to do or it's indeed right for you. So moving to the tree on the left here, which is exactly the same size pot. It's not exactly the same size tree because I just don't have two. But what you'll see here is it's been repotted in a 50% herbaceous compost mixed with 50% of a more mature plant compost. The structure of it's rather different. If I squeeze that, it sort of retains a little bit of shape. There's a little bit of substance to it there, should we say, really. It breaks apart quite easily though. It's not sort of solid, it's not like a clay-like material, so that should be worth noting. Where, you know, if I take a handful of this and give it a sort of squeeze in that kind of way, it immediately just sort of falls apart pretty much. So it's a rather different structure, and it's a very different proposition, to be honest. So in order to kind of even the experiment out a little bit, these two trees aren't like desperately short of water, because when they get very, very dry, that can sort of change the properties of the compost really. So they're sort of middle to slightly dry. That's absolutely fine. And what I'll be doing is adding exactly the same amount of water to each tree and seeing how much sort of appears out the bottom. So a rather more technical video, but I think you'll find the results very, very interesting. I know I certainly did and was quite surprised, to be honest. So regardless of what compost you choose, big no-nos are putting a tray beneath the tree to catch any water and trying to make it hold water that way, because you'll just rot the roots. That's a really bad idea. Acers hate having roots that are too wet. They do need to be both free draining, and the first thing I'd say is both these composts I think are free draining. It's a question of degree. Neither of them is extremely clay, as we'll see, but how much difference actually is there? Another big no-no is to not allow the drainage hole at the bottom to drain freely. So mine are either popped on stones in the garden, or you could raise them up on pot feet, that sort of thing, because what we do need is everything to drain off at the bottom. So the first point to mention for this particular compost, which is the very free draining one that the nursery provided, the water has just disappeared. Lots of bubbles, the air gaps are getting filled in really quickly, and the compost is performing really well. What you'll see is a little bit of water suddenly start to appear from the bottom, just in fairly small quantities there really, which is quite surprising. It hasn't actually poured straight through. It's not like cacti sort of compost, which is in ridiculously free draining. It's kind of like grit really. It's a bit slower than that. So here we have the second tree that again is on some little wooden feet there. We'll pour exactly the same amount. So this is exactly another litre of water going in on the top there. And we'll see how this compost reacts, to be honest with you. Does it kind of react the same way? Let's see. So I think you'll see the water disappears pretty quick. It's not quite the same amount of bubbles though. So that kind of implies that the air pockets within the compost haven't kind of been filled quite as well as the other compost that we're using. But yeah, it's disappeared, it's getting absorbed. So not really massively dissimilar to the more freer draining variety. But that's only kind of half the story, because if you look at the tray at the bottom there, you can see water's coming through immediately. So even though this is not supposed to be as free draining as the other compost, the water's coming through straight away, to be honest with you. There's a couple of drips down the side, that's just my accident, but it's definitely coming from the hole at the bottom, which I find quite interesting. So when I actually said I've used a different compost in this actual pot, I kind of lied actually. The reason being is that I've repotted the plant, that's true, using my 50-50 mix of ericaceous compost and more mature compost, but I haven't actually taken anything away from the original. So this started live in a 1 litre pot like this with the very free draining sort of nursery compost in it. I haven't removed any of that. What I've actually done is I've slip potted it. So really all I'm actually doing is adding my own mix to the compost that's already there around the edge. So as you can see, I've certainly added some volume to it. I'll probably sort of at least double or triple the volume of compost in the pot, but I have indeed retained the original compost that the tree came with as well. So as these trees get repotted, I'm kind of adding more of my own mixture to the original mixture. So eventually, of course, the tree will be nearly all my compost, but then it'll be a lot bigger in a lot bigger pot. But then its needs will have changed slightly because it's a more mature tree. So I've got 1 or 2 videos on repotting trees that have been really popular, so thank you for that. Just as a quick way this works, you would basically put your new compost mix around the edges here like that, just with keeping the tree in its plastic technical pot. What I'll then do is sort of take the whole technical pot out of the compost, leaving a hole inside, and then remove the tree from the technical pot, the little black pot there, and sort of place it in place in the upside down sandcastle I've kind of made, or the dent I've made in the compost. And that works really well because it doesn't disturb the roots at all. And again, I'm just augmenting the compost that's really already there. And as I mentioned in other videos, if you try to take the tree outside the little technical pot and the compost falls to pieces or starts falling to pieces, it's just not ready to be repotted, so I would leave it. So it's pretty much stopped dripping through now, so pouring the contents of the bowl there into the measuring jug. Don't tell my wife that I borrowed this, but there we go. We can see there's about 200 millilitres of liquid that's appeared. So just to be clear, that's from the very free draining compost, or that's known to be free draining, should we put it that way. And that's actually what's happened. So if we repeat the same exercise with the other tree, let's kind of see what the results are really, because I was kind of expecting something different, to be honest with you, at least a different result, but sort of fairly carefully pouring that through there. Quite surprisingly, it's basically the same, which really, really confused me, to be honest. So then I thought to myself, well, what about if there's a real torrential downpour and they both get a load more water? So what I then did is pour a 2nd litre of water into each one. Sorry about the few drips there, but I don't think it'll really affect the results. And let's kind of see what happens then. And as you can see there, this time it hasn't sort of disappeared instantly. It's kind of stayed on the surface. We'll come back to that actually, because that proved to be a very, very interesting result. So in this case, back to the tree with the ericaceous and the more mature compost mix, my mix we call it, and in goes the litre of water. And let's see what happens there. More bubbles this time. You can see a bit more activity on the top, and indeed that shows that the air gaps again are being filled up with water, which were much more easily filled on the other compost, which is interesting. But what I would say is that you can already sort of start to see that the water's kind of disappearing, it's reducing in level, which is really quite surprising, because my expectation would be that this isn't so free draining, so it's going to retain it more. Whereas actually you can quite see there, it's literally pouring out the bottom, so it's almost reached a critical point, and that's what's happened. But on the free draining compost, inverted commas, hardly anything's appearing at all. So this really, really surprised me. So certainly rather difficult to explain, and my best guess is that the things like pine bark in there that's probably been used, and other elements in the compost that the nursery's used, has kind of swollen up. It's kind of, all the air gaps have been filled really quickly, so it then becomes slightly more waterlogged on a temporary basis, but we'll have to wait and see what happens, to be honest. And just to say, if you'd like to come with me on my Acer journey, please do like and subscribe to my little channel. It really, really helps. I've also recently set up a Patreon site, so that's a great way of supporting me too, and help out with some of the costs of my excursions really. There's also the offer of some personal help, if you'd like it, either in a group format or on a one-to-one basis. So after several minutes I've come back to both of the trees. As you can see, it's kind of looking waterlogged and looks like there's going to be a problem here. Very, very little water appearing whatsoever. Whereas the mixture I use, there's absolutely loads of water at the bottom. So much so, in fact, I'm going to have to sort of quickly decant that out. So this is just cutting to the situation where I've, tipped out all the water from the tray. As you can probably see, it's pretty much stopped now. And I've got 800 ml water back out of my 1 litre that I added. So that's like 80% reappeared. A bit more might have dripped through, but basically it's kind of stopped now. So waiting another 10 minutes or so, the water level's definitely sort of going down at the top of the tree here. So it's definitely draining through, that's true. But the amount of water at the bottom still isn't that excessive, to be honest with you. So while that was still draining off, I thought I'd just mention why the mature compost mixed with the ericaceous compost actually works quite well, and it's fairly free draining in the normal sense of the word, I suppose, really. So that's kind of the more mature plant compost. As you can see, it's not clay, it's not sort of formed a clay ball there, but it's quite substantial really. Whereas the ericaceous compost here has got a lot more sort of organic material in it and has a really different texture to it. So I think you can see that actually if you squeeze that, it's not the same at all. And I just think that the reason this mixture does actually work quite well is because this is kind of the free draining element of the compost that you really require for Japanese maples or acers. But the other more mature compost actually contains enough moisture retention to work quite well actually. So another slight controversy is that you don't really need ericaceous compost. These acers are perfectly happy in sort of neutral soil. Not alkaline, they don't like that for sure, but neutral soil will be fine. And I'm sure it probably is actually. However, I think it's the ericaceous compost adding some better drainage that really is a much more important issue. So we have a little plant pot I've just constructed full of sort of the rather more mature compost, and as you can see the water just sort of sit there on top of it. It's hard to be entirely accurate with these little experiments, but we'll do our best sort of thing. And it's coming through. You can see on the pot at the bottom there, the tray at the bottom, that it's kind of working, but it's a fairly slow process. And here we've got the ericaceous compost, just a similar experiment really. And as you can see, I've just poured it on and it's kind of pretty much disappeared already. So it's certainly moist and it certainly retains water in that sense. But as you can see, the excess is pouring through really, really well. So there's a bit of evidence to support my theory that the mixture of both does offer something of interest really. So another 10 minutes go by and we go back to the tree that's in the nursery compost and it's still standing there. What we can see though at the bottom now is that it is definitely running through, and accumulating at the base. But wait for this because there's some very interesting results coming, to be honest with you. So while I was waiting, I took the opportunity to feel the side of this pot, which is away from the sun, as is the side of this one. Well, you can see this pot is rather darker and was considerably cooler actually. So again, just to note, if you're worried about high temperatures, porous pots will indeed have a cooling effect when they're watered. So has this tree finished draining yet? Let's have a quick check. And no, it's still going. So time for a measure up, and what we'll see is I've got all of the 1 litre of water that I put in extra has come back, to be honest with you, which is kind of very, very strange. So if you're stuck with it to the end, we have a very interesting result. So I left it about another half an hour or so and managed to get another half a litre out of the tree. So to be honest, what does that mean? In the first instance with sort of my mixture around the original mixture, we're getting back from 2 litres about 1 litre. Whereas from the freer draining compost, eventually over time, you get about an extra 700 millilitres of liquid back, which is quite a big difference. So with a very free draining compost, which you can easily create, using 50% pine bark or perlite or grit, etc., you can sort of mimic that. If you want to lose water, then that's ideal. It really, really is. So the chance of you sort of saturating your tree too much and getting root rot is substantially reduced. And it's indeed why the growers no doubt use a mixture like that. Has to be said though that where they're growing these trees is in a polytunnel with no wind and no direct sun. So your trees, if you continue with the same mixture, will potentially could need a lot of watering, and that may suit you or it may not. On the other hand, if you go with the eraceous compost mixed with the more mature compost, it's an alternative. It still drains really well, but in my experiment it did hang on to a lot more water, so it would last longer between waterings. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and very much on your particular zone that you live in over the world. If you live in an incredibly hot environment, you really want to go down the route of having water retention, and that will be a benefit to you. I'd even put them in a ceramic pot as well, to be honest with you, and even overpot them slightly, because that's all going to help water retention. On the other hand, if you live in a very wet scenario and you're worried about root rot, then the very free draining compost is going to be really beneficial. I think in the UK, which is zone 8, we're neither 7 or 9, so actually both strategies are kind of viable. The big key thing is, though, in either way, whatever you do, don't overpot Japanese maples. If the pot size is relatively small, that will control the amount of water in the pot, obviously very well. So that's to be highly recommended, to be honest. The really massive tip from me, though, is that if you're going to use a compost that retains water a little better, then just water the maples when they get slightly dry. If you just keep pouring more and more water onto them, because that's what you do every day, or the sun is shining, or take a guess at it, and water them en masse without seeing which individual plant actually needs, that can cause huge problems. So what's the takeaway for me? Basically, I'll carry on doing the same thing because it works for me very well in my scenario, but I do use porous pots, and I think that's very important. What I might do, though, is that for dwarf maples, which notoriously really hate soggy feet or soggy roots, I might actually sort of change that mix slightly and make it a bit more free draining. But for the majority of my bigger trees, I'm really happy how they perform, and even in the summer I can sort of get away with watering every 2 or 3 days, and that really suits me, to be honest.